Prologue. There is nothing quite like watching two grown men play rock, paper, scissors in a drunk tank on a dreary Friday to make you reconsider all of your life choices. The police station in Dakota County, Nebraska, was about the size of a large hen house with half of the action. Most of the officers were out for the evening, although it was only 2:30 on a Friday. The only one left at his desk was Deputy Travis Dooler, who was supposed to be keeping watch over the occupants of the jail cell, but was too busy playing a game on his phone to bother. Hayes didn't mind the deputy's lack of decorum. It gave him an opportunity to take in the bizarre scene unfolding within the jail cell from a distance before he mustered the courage to approach. The only jail cell that the police station had was more or less a drunk tank. It made up the entire length of the back wall of the station, with one pathetically small window and old-fashioned bars. It hadn't been renovated in 50 years, and it had seen its fair share of occupants. Drunk ones. If the vomit stains on the walls were any indication, its current occupants were divided between drunk and sober, although it was still a toss-up between the toothless man and the pissed-off ex-Marine. The 30-something jarhead was in a heated argument with the other occupant. The toothless one looked to be well into his 60s, and his unkempt beard and yellowed mustache told Hayes everything he needed to know.
"You're an imbecile!"
the younger man blurted out furiously.
"It's rock, paper, scissors, and shoot. You shoot on shoot, not before, not after,"
he exclaimed loudly, although the other man looked far too out of it to retaliate with the same amount of outrage. The old drunk gave a sleazy smile and shrugged as though he couldn't care less.
"Let's go again,"
the younger one grumbled, composing himself. The old man nodded and stuck out his fist, the younger one mimicking the gesture.
"Rock, paper, scissors, shoot. Frank, seriously."
The younger man threw his hands up in a dramatic gesture that was so unlike anything Hayes had been told to expect from the man that it very nearly made Hayes smile.
"You just want to watch the world burn, don't you?"
he grumbled, crossing his arms over his chest as he began pacing around the cell, muttering to himself. The older man shot him a smile that showed every single space where he was missing teeth. Hayes squared his shoulders, brushed his suit free of any dust, and advanced towards Deputy Travis Dooler. The show was well and truly over now, and he had a man to collect.
"Deputy?"
Hayes said, pulling the man away from his phone long enough to look up. He startled and straightened in his chair as he took in the fancy badge Hayes was dangling in his face.
"I'm here for Mr. Thérault,"
he informed the confused officer, gesturing towards the drunk tank and the two idiots within.
"You'll have to—"
"His bail has been paid, and he's to be released into my custody immediately. Please refer to your superior for any further inquiries."
Hayes cut him off smoothly, not having the time or the patience to deal with a less than competent deputy. The young man looked lost and confused for a second. It was just long enough of a pause to capture the attention of the two inmates.
"Chaton, t'es venu me chercher. Finally!"
The young man Hayes was there to collect blurted out from his cell in odd-sounding French. Hayes didn't speak French, but he'd heard enough of it to recognize the language, if not the accent. The ex-Marine was hanging onto the bars like a damsel in distress, batting his eyelashes in mock desperation. Hayes gritted his teeth against the man's idiocy and did his best not to comment.
"Please unlock the cell,"
Hayes told the confused deputy, more of a direct order than a request, his jaw tight. This made the young man jump up from his chair like a startled cat and dart over to the cell door to comply, but he fumbled with the lock, seemingly incapable of finding the right key. Meanwhile, the jarhead idiot was still mouthing off in his cell, making Hayes question his earlier observation of sobriety.
"You're booing? Great lay to."
He was talking to the drunk old man like the semi-conscious sexagenarian could understand. It was unsettling, to say the least.
"Thérault, you're good to go,"
the young deputy informed the babbling idiot as he pulled the jail cell open. The young officer squared his shoulders as though they hadn't both seen him play on his phone like a bored teenager only minutes before. Thérault clapped his hands joyfully and shot the drunk, toothless man one last look before he backed his way out of the cell.
"Keep away from the hard stuff, Frank,"
he told the man, with finger guns pointed for effect.
"Don't forget me,"
he added, with the dramatic flair of a bad actress in the 1920s as he turned to face Hayes. Hayes rolled his eyes only once at the ridiculous display. He crossed his arms over his chest and watched with detached curiosity as the man walked towards him. He'd seemed smaller in the cell. As he approached, Captain Thérault appeared to be closer to Hayes's own 6 feet 4 inches than he'd thought. He was stockier than Hayes. His shoulders were wide and pulling at the seams of his army green shirt.
You the limo driver?
The man asked, his smile far too mischievous for a man who'd spent the night in a puke and piss-smelling cell with a drunk man and no bed. Hayes rolled his eyes again. He couldn't help it.
Thank you, Deputy.
Hayes told the young cop, before turning around and walking out of the station, ignoring Captain Thérault altogether. He didn't look back to make sure the idiot was following him. There wasn't anywhere else for him to go. To his credit, the jarhead waited until they were outside the building before he began the unavoidable spate of questions.
You just here to collect me, or?
He was walking next to Hayes now, his green eyes examining Hayes's profile as if he could gather information from it.
I'm your new partner.
Hayes told the man with the cold and detached professionalism he'd perfected over the years.
Ha!
The man answered, stopping dead in his tracks in surprise. Hayes stopped and turned around, less than pleased to be faced with yet another dramatic scene, but willing to play along with him, if only to get going again.
No can do, compadre. Not your pencil-pushing ass,
he added, his tone an odd mix of amusement and anger. Hayes shrugged. He was used to this kind of reaction. People didn't generally expect much from him. He was tall and a little on the lankier side in build. Plus, he'd been told that his muddled British accent didn't help his goody-two-shoes image.
I'm a Navy Seal Marksman. I think you'll find me more than capable of covering even your sloppier-than-average ass.
Hayes answered quickly, watching the other man's face change slowly, as though he'd been anticipating Hayes's answer all along. Hayes wouldn't doubt it.
Fair enough. I can deal with Navy, not like your Air Force,
the man said and shrugged, as though reasoning out loud. Hayes huffed a laugh because they could both agree on that, at the very least. He offered Hayes his hand, a small grin appearing on his face.
Call me Beckett,
the man said in a show of good faith. Hayes considered the man's hand for a moment before reaching out to shake it.
Hayes!
He answered with a nod. Without another word, both men began walking again. Hayes unlocked the truck he'd rented and watched Beckett swing into the passenger seat with surprising grace for a man his size.
You said marksman, right?
Beckett asked as Hayes started the car. Hayes nodded but offered nothing else.
Great. I'ma need a little favor,
Beckett said casually.
A favor?
Hayes asked, as he pulled away from the police station parking lot and onto the road.
Yeah, a favor. Good way to start a partnership, start an IOU type of list, keep us loyal to each other and whatnot.
Beckett rambled on, giving Hayes the distinct impression that he was being bullshitted into something. Hayes shrugged.
I suppose,
he answered, far more intrigued than he probably should be. Beckett practically cackled with glee in the passenger seat.
All right, drive! I'll guide you,
Beckett said excitedly. He glanced at his watch with a triumphant smile on his lips. Hayes felt both uneasy and strangely comfortable with it. Logically, he knew how he'd found himself sneaking up a bell tower with his sniper rifle instead of driving back home as he'd been instructed. He'd obviously driven there and followed Beckett's orders all the way up to the top of the tower. He just wasn't sure why, and none of Beckett's babbling was making it any clearer.
Tell me again,
Hayes said, as they finally reached the last step at the top of the tower. The massive copper bell at the very top took up almost the entire opening, leaving only a small pathway for walking around the bell.
The DEA fucked me over. They messed up their sting operation and dumped me in a cell because they didn't know what else to do with me,
Beckett summarized quickly, looking down at the city below from different angles, as though figuring out the best position from which to shoot.
And you were with the DEA because...
Hayes left this open-ended for Beckett's answer.
I was on loan to them. They needed an inside guy who could speak French. The daughter went to Paris last year, and she's obsessed with France,
Beckett explained with a shrug. He was squatting near one of the large openings of the bell tower.
Bingo,
He muttered under his breath.
Set it up right here.
Hayes didn't argue. He set down the sniper case and slowly began to assemble his weapon with practiced ease.
So you dated the girl, weaseled your way into the family business, and worked as the inside guy for the DEA?
Hayes asked, more or less just repeating the strange and less than plausible information he'd been fed.
Exactly. My info was solid too. All the DEA had to do was play their hand well and the whole family would be behind bars by now.
Beckett complained, obviously annoyed. Hayes said as he walked past Beckett with his modified MSR-10 long-range semi-automatic rifle and proceeded to line up the sights in accordance with Beckett's earlier position.
What am I aiming at exactly?
Hayes asked, having no idea how he'd gotten this far without asking before.
The DEA scumbag who threw me in jail is sitting pretty in that little blue house with the dark green shutters. Do you see it?
Affirmative.
Hayes answered, mostly out of habit.
Do you see the DEA-issued SUV in the driveway?
Beckett asked.
Affirmative.
Hayes repeated.
Well, bud, in approximately 12 seconds, this mighty bell right here is going to ring the hour, and you'll get 30 seconds of blessed noise pollution to wreak havoc on both of those lovely government properties,
Beckett said, and Hayes almost laughed. The demand was absurd, almost like a little boy throwing eggs at his ex-girlfriend's house out of spite. Hayes wasn't sure why he was so excited by it.
That pretty thing of yours, is it?
Not official. No ballistic report will ever be traced back to her,
Hayes assured Beckett.
Her?
Beckett repeated, obviously amused. Hayes looked back at the man standing behind him. His large arms were crossed over his chest and one eyebrow was raised in amusement.
You want me to carry out this pissing contest or not?
Hayes demanded, challenging Beckett effortlessly. Beckett threw his hands up in surrender and laughed, before glancing at his watch.
4 seconds,
he said, leaning forward so he could watch the shot without being in Hayes's way. Hayes took a deep breath and stared down the barrel of his rifle. Right on time, the giant bell behind him began to swing and ring. The sound was absurdly loud from his position, but it wasn't nearly as bad as some of the war zones Hayes had fought in. Without so much as a second thought, he fired a volley of bullets at the pretty house down the block. The bay window exploded, shards of glass flying in every direction. As each round hit the exterior paneling, chunks of wood and sheetrock were hurled across the pristine lawn. Hayes took another deep breath and popped the tires of the gleaming SUV one after the other, leaving intact the only one he couldn't reach. He then proceeded to shoot out the windshield, taillights, and most of the left side of the SUV.
2 seconds,
Beckett warned, just as the bell rang its last ring, the echo bouncing around in the tower. Neither one of them spoke for a long moment, simply staring at the wrecked mess they'd created. There wasn't much left of Hayes's targets, just a mess of holes and shards.
Well, hell, guess we can be partners,
Beckett said excitedly, after a long moment of admiration, clapping Hayes on the back of his shoulder like a proud father at a baseball game. Hayes huffed a breath but felt strangely settled next to the wild man he now had to call partner. Something about his strange brand of chaos sat just right in Hayes's gut.